Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie. Um, so welcome everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar about the metadata lifecycle, where we will be going over how your metadata goes from your repository to the Digital Public Library of America through the Sunshine State Digital Network. So this will be mostly informal, although we do have slides. And what we're hoping to do is to help demystify how this process works. So please feel free to ask any questions that you may have at any time during the webinar using the chat box, and we will stop and answer your question. Next slide. So we understand how anxiety inducing it can be to think about reviewing and remediating your metadata, or how anxiety inducing it can be to and feel like you might not be ready, or your metadata is not perfect. It might not be ready for a platform or a repository like the DPLA, but no fear, you're not on your own. There's no need to worry. We're here to help you. So who are we that I keep talking about? I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Kayla Zayas Ruiz. I am the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator, which is, for those of you who don't know, the Digital Public Library of America hub for the state of Florida. So we work with cultural heritage institutions around the state of Florida to share content to the Digital Public Library of America. We offer training and other services to help libraries, museums, archives, and historical societies feel confident in their digital libraries and sharing that content to a worldwide audience. And I am positioned at Florida State University, and I'll pass it on to Jamie.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Rogers. I am the Assistant Director of Digital Collections at Florida International University. And like Kayla, Elliot, and Matthew, I am a member of the Sunshine State Digital Network implementation team, really the group that began initiating the process of creating DPLA a few years back, not the entire group, but part of the group that began the implementation. And so I'm also the chair of the Sunshine State Digital Network Training Working Group that develops training materials and workshops related to digital initiatives and making those available throughout the state. And I work very closely with the South Florida community and cultural heritage organizations to help with outreach and getting people started in the process of contributing their content to the Digital Public Library of America. And I'll pass it on to Elliot.
Hi everyone, my name is Elliot Williams. I'm a metadata librarian at the University of Miami. And as Jamie said, I'm also on the SSDN implementation team, and I'm the chair of the metadata working group for the SSDN, who provide resources and best practices for creating metadata to share with DPLA. I also work very closely with Jamie and working with institutions in sort of the South Florida, greater South Florida region, helping them review their metadata and harvesting it to send on to DPLA. And I'll pass it on to Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matthew Miguez. I'm the metadata librarian at Florida State University. Like everyone else, I'm a member of the Sunshine State Digital Network implementation team. I'm also on the metadata working group, and I serve as the harvest and technical lead for each month's harvest. So I'm responsible for getting all the data together and passing it along to DPLA.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. So briefly, what we'll be covering today will be how to do an internal metadata review, we'll cover the SSDN onboarding process and remediation tips and tools that you can use throughout that process, how we harvest your metadata from our partners for inclusion in DPLA, and of course answering any questions that you all may have.
All right, so I'm going to jump right in and talk about our kind of pre-onboarding internal metadata review. So you may be thinking about contributing content to DPLA, but you're not quite sure where your metadata is at, if you have the required fields for the for contribution to the Sunshine State Digital Network. And I'll go over very briefly how you can take a look at your metadata and kind of decide if you're ready to start the conversation with the Sunshine State Digital Network. So here I have a list of possible fields, a set that will demonstrate that you're ready to contribute to the Sunshine State Digital Network with the required elements, and another record that indicates that you may not quite be ready to contribute to the Sunshine State Digital Network. I've also included a link to the metadata participation guidelines. After the presentation, we're going to share the slides. We'll send them out to the registrants, and you'll be able to take a look at the guidelines, and they have a more detailed overview about our requirements and our recommendations. And so those guidelines are also available on the Sunshine State Digital Network website. At the end of the presentation, there will also be additional links that may be useful for everyone here. So you may take a look at these two kind of faux records, similar topic, and say that the record on the right may look more rich. It has more subject headings and keywords. It offers more information about the physical location. Unfortunately, is missing key requirements for participation in the Sunshine State Digital Network and DPLA. And those are title, it's missing an identifier, it's missing a rights statement, and it's missing a link to the record. So you may say that some of these things are available in the back end of your system, and they may not display on the front end, and that is perfectly fine. And we'll go into that a little bit later. We'll address you know, the types of information that you can find in your front end display and the things that are available in what we call our OAI PMH feed. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so we'll cover all of that a little bit later. But you can see here from this display, we don't have a tremendous number of requirements for participation in the Sunshine State Digital Network. However, the more metadata you have, the more enhanced your records are, the more, pardon me, the more discoverable they'll be. So we're not saying only include title, identifier, rights, and link, but those are kind of just the key things that need to be in place for your participation in the Sunshine State Digital Network. So when you're taking a look at your records, you may say some of these things, we don't ever create information about thumbnail links. We don't create information about possibly unique identifiers. So some of this is actually system generated metadata. So I have here a couple of examples, system generated metadata versus people generated metadata. And so on the left-hand side, things like thumbnail links, the publicly accessible links to your records, and sometimes unique identifiers are generated by your digital library system, and it's not something that you're responsible for. However, you are responsible for things like title and subject headings, and occasionally unique identifiers. So it really depends on the digital library system that you are using, whether or not it generates these unique identifiers and the links to them. And that's something that during the onboarding process, we can help clarify for you through consultation. And below, I have, and I don't want to throw this in there to look scary, but this is the OAI PMH XML and what it looks like. So you can see the Dublin core identifier field and how it would appear in the back end, as well as the thumbnail link. And these are actual records from FIU's digital collections versus things like title, creator, coverage, and date that are generated by the folks that are entering the metadata manually into the system. So other metadata quality issues may be resolved by the people who input the metadata, but remediation may also be handled one at a time or in batches. So whether you choose to update in batches or through individual record updates may depend on your digital library system's capabilities. Some systems don't easily allow for batch updates. However, if they do, you may want to make sure you're following a very strict pattern. So it's difficult to do batch updates for items or for issues that are one-offs. You want to make sure this is an issue across large amounts of records. So if for some reason you have an @ symbol in your geospatial coverage, I'm not sure why, but you might have an @ symbol in your geospatial coverage and you want to change it to the term AT, which I'm not actually sure is any better, but this is hypothetical. You would do something like that in a batch update. So there have to be like enough similar changes to warrant a batch. And if that is possible, that is the best case scenario because it's the least amount of manual labor in updating your records. So we all like large batches here. It's making me hungry looking at all these sweets. And then finally, something that may or may not indicate that this is something within your direct control is whether you have a hosted digital library system or something that's hosted locally. So if your digital library system is hosted by a vendor or another organization, you may need to coordinate your metadata updates in batches or even sometimes individually with that particular organization. So logistics may depend on your contract and agreement as well. You may have worked into your contract that they would handle all of these batch updates for you, or it may indicate that you kind of have to go in there and work on this on your own. But really, you know, all of this stuff would come out in the process of you consulting with both the Sunshine State Digital Network group as we're doing the onboarding process and as you work with your digital library system technical team or vendor.
Okay, so once you've done your internal metadata review, you may feel like you are now ready to apply to be an SSDN content contributor to the DPLA. So the first thing you would do is submit a content contributor application. It's a really short application. It asks about 10 questions about your collections and your system. And once you submit that application, it gets placed in a queue, which then gets reviewed by the SSDN implementation team. After we review that, someone from SSDN will contact your organization to schedule a virtual meeting with you or whoever the contacts are at your organization who will be working on this partnership. So once we've scheduled that meeting, before we meet with you and your organization, we'll review your collections and we'll assess your metadata quality and the content in your collections. And then we'll meet with you and we'll talk about that review that we've done. We'll talk to you about the process for the harvest, timelines that your organization is comfortable with, as well as the current capacity of the SSDN to harvest your content, depending on how many items you might be contributing or things like that. We'll discuss the partnership agreement, and we'll address any questions that you might have about the process or anything that came up during the review process. After that meeting, we then send you the partnership agreement for your institution to sign, and then you start preparing for your first harvest. And anywhere in between that first meeting and when you are about to get ready, when we're about to get ready to harvest your content for the first time, we're happy to meet with you in between there to address any questions you might have, to do additional review or consultation. And of course, we can do that in between any harvest if your organization is interested in that. But that's over the general onboarding process that we go through. This information is also available in our Getting Started guide, which is available on our website. But I thought I'd summarize it here for you as well. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So when we say we are going to do a metadata review process, what we're looking for is any issues that you may not have noticed or problems that may have in your metadata that you didn't catch during your internal review. It's always good to have another set of eyes on your metadata. So some of the things that we look for, again, are all the required fields there. We look at the content of your metadata. So that's like, what do your titles look like? What do your descriptions look like? Do these things need more context? Is there consistency in your metadata? So do all of your subject headings that categorize specific types of content match? Sometimes we've seen issues where there might be a space or a period at the end of a subject heading in certain records where there isn't one in another. And that could cause issues with people trying to find related content in your repository and in DPLA. And then we work with you to map your metadata to DPLA's metadata application profile so that we can ensure that the fields that you're using get mapped to the appropriate label in DPLA, so that if you have your descriptions are in like your abstract field in your digital library system, they can be mapped appropriately to the description field in DPLA. Similar things with the appropriate dates that you might have. Some records might have more than one date in them, depending on how your system works. You might have like a digitization date, an acquisition date, and a creation date. And we want to make sure that the creation date is being mapped to DPLA and not any additional dates. So that's just to make sure that the data that you want to show up in DPLA is showing up in DPLA appropriately. And you know, a lot of the recommendations that we make during the review process are purely that. They're purely recommendations. For the most part, everyone's metadata is pretty good to begin with. Your metadata does not have to be perfect, but we want to be able to identify any issues that might cause problems with discoverability and make sure that your metadata is the most useful that it can be for users in DPLA. So, oh, sorry, I was just clearing my throat. In between harvests, we also do quick spot checks. So that first initial pass happens during the onboarding process where we really do that in-depth review. We're looking at your repository, we're looking at your OEI feed in depth. Obviously, we can't do that for every single harvest. So in between harvests, so after that first one, we do some spot checking. So we check if all of the required fields are there, if the right number of records that you intended to share are included in that harvest, if your thumbnails are there, and if your metadata fits the mapping that we did, or if adjustments need to be made in between harvests. Because sometimes when we add new collections, there might be some adjusting that needs to happen for mapping with those new collections. So there is some additional quality checking that happens in between harvests, but it is a lot less in-depth than that first deep dive that we do during the onboarding process.
This is Elliot. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk a little bit more about what we're actually doing when we're reviewing your metadata. what we're looking at and some of the tools that we use. And the goal is to help you not only understand what SSDN is doing when we review your metadata, but to help equip you to look at your metadata the same way that we do to sort of see what we see. So during the process that Kayla was just discussing, where we sort of do this initial check of metadata, we sometimes look at records in the repository the way that an end user would do, but a lot of the review that we do involves looking at your metadata via OAI PMH, as Jamie mentioned. And OAI PMH, if you're not familiar with it, stands for the Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. It's also sometimes abbreviated to just OAI because it's sort of a long acronym. And that's the mechanism that we use for harvesting your metadata to send to DPLA. So that's the version of the metadata we're most interested in. And since we don't have access to the back end of your systems, it provides us a way to see your metadata in bulk rather than just looking at one record at a time. Basically, OAI PMH is a standardized way for systems to share metadata with each other in XML format. Most repository systems provide an OAI feed of your metadata out of the box. It's not something you'll have to build for yourself, although sometimes you do have to turn it on. The SSDN Getting Started guide, which Kayla mentioned and is on our website and is also linked in the slides here, has some more information about OAI PMH, as well as information about finding your OAI PMH endpoint, as it's called, in several of the more commonly used repository systems. Next slide, please. So again, not trying to scare anyone by putting a bunch of XML up on the screen, but I did think it was helpful to sort of see side by side to the same record in two different ways. So an OAI PMH feed, as it's called, includes metadata just in raw XML. So the example on the left here is a record as it displays to users. And it's the same record in XML on the right, accessed via OAI PMH. So depending on the system you use, your OAI metadata may look slightly different than it does in other places. Content DM, for example, lets you map individual metadata fields to specific Dublin core fields for including in your OAI feed. So there's a lot of variability there. But some other systems, Iondora, for example, just gives you exactly the same record you see on the back end with a little less variability. And we're happy to help you sort of figure out how that works in your system if you have questions about it. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as you can see here, the physical description field maps to DC format in the OAI PMH metadata. So it's just that idea of mapping to a slightly different metadata format. You'll also notice how the physical location and genre fields, which are in the record that users can see, aren't included in the OAI PMH record, so we won't be able to send those fields on to DPLA. Next slide. So I think OAI PMH can seem intimidating, but it's actually really easy to get the hang of. And you don't need any fancy tools or tricks to access an OAI PMH feed. You can see your feed just by entering the right address in a web browser. It's really that easy. So I'm not going to go too in-depth into how OAI PMH works today, but here's an example of a URL just to kind of help you wrap your heads around how it works. So this is an OAI PMH URL for FIU's SOVEC repository. And the first part in green is the base URL for their repository. That's going to be the same for every command we send. The next part in blue is the verb, which is basically the command that you're sending to the OAI service. OAI PMH has 6 verbs, and in this case, we're asking it to show all of the records based on the other parameters that we're sending. The next part in red is the metadata prefix, which tells it what metadata format to send us back, in this case using Dublin core, but depending on your system, it could be mods or MARC or other things as well. And then the last in black is the set code. In this case, CGM stands for Coral Gables memory, so it's only going to send us the records for that set. And so by changing the verb and the parameters, you can get different sets of records from the repository. So it really is very straightforward to do. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, for harvesting, SSDN only has access to the metadata that's in your OAI PMH feed. So you want to make sure that the metadata looks the way you want it to. Depending on your digital library system, the metadata in your feed may not look the same, as I mentioned. So you want to make sure that it's available in the right format, for example, mods or Dublin core. You want to make sure that all of the sets you want to share are enabled for harvesting via OAI PMH. and make sure that all of the important fields you want to share are included, and the fields that you don't want to share are not included. So I think understanding and feeling comfortable with your own OAI PMH feed is a great way to start getting ready for sharing metadata with DPLA. It can give you a different view of your metadata and help you identify areas that maybe could use some improvement. Next slide. Another tool that we use for doing metadata analysis at the SSDN level, and that can be really useful at the local level as well, is OpenRefine, which some of you have probably heard of if you do much metadata work. OpenRefine describes itself as a, quote, powerful tool for messy data, and it really is a really powerful tool that can do a lot of things. It's not exactly a spreadsheet tool like Excel, but in some ways it works the same. You can upload your data into OpenRefine and then use its tools to examine your data in new ways and even do some really powerful editing on your metadata. But remember that you then have to move those edits back into your repository. Refine accepts a lot of different data formats. So basically whatever format you can export from your repository system, you can probably load into OpenRefine. I often use OpenRefine to examine metadata that I've downloaded from OAI PMH fields that I was just talking about. We don't have time to do a full OpenRefine tutorial today, but there are a ton of great resources out there about using it in libraries and archives. PA Digital, which is the DPLA hub for Pennsylvania, has a great introduction, which I've linked on the slides here, but you can easily find a lot more. Next slide, please. So the best part of using OpenRefine, in my opinion, is its faceting and filtering tools. Sort of like Kayla was discussing earlier, one of the things we look for is, are all of the values in a field sort of formatted correctly? Do they all make sense? And OpenRefine makes it really easy to get a high-level view of your metadata and spot places where there might be issues. The screenshot here is a facet for the mod's geographic field in a set of records. And as you can see, it makes it really easy to spot some of the variation there is, for example, in punctuation and spacing. And so now we would know to go back and clean those up. There's a lot that you can do with OpenRefine, and I've put some examples of the kinds of questions you might try and answer. You can check for required fields. You can look for duplicate titles. We don't require that titles are unique, but it is best practice to not repeat titles if you can. You can analyze controlled vocabulary fields and look for terms that should be cleaned up, as I mentioned. And what I think is really great about OpenRefine is it makes it easy to sort of combine lots of those queries. So you can do things like search for everything that was created before 1989 and look at its right statement. That's a really easy thing to do. And that just lets you ask questions of your metadata and make sure that things look the way you want it to. And these are all the types of questions that SSDN looks at when we're reviewing your metadata for harvest to DPLA. So knowing how to do that yourself can be really powerful. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
All right, so the last step of this process, once your metadata is exposed as XML through OAI PMH, is to map it into the actual schema that DPLA uses internally for all of their records. So on the right-hand side, we've got kind of a stub of a OAI record with a bunch of fields we've looked at. And then on the left, there's a stub of a JSON document. All of the data we send to DPLA is in a JavaScript object notation that looks kind of like this. And you can see that we've got some fields that are blank, so title, rights, creator, all of those just have blank spots because kind of what we do with the transformation process is we build this template and then just plug in data according to where it's supposed to go. So if you go to the next slide, please. What we have at the Sunshine State Digital Network are a bunch of little robots. These robots are actually Python code, but it's easier to think about them in this abstract way because they do really simple things fundamentally. So there's a little robot that likes to identify and move around DC title elements. There's another little robot that likes to do the same, but with DC subject. And for all of the different metadata schemas and elements within those schemas. There's a little robot that's purpose-built to hook onto that element and then put it somewhere else. So in the next slide, we see our DC title robot starting to do its job. So the XML data comes in from your OAI PMH feed. The robot scans it, scans every single record in it, and for every DC title it finds, like it's identified this one right here, if we go to the next slide, you can see that it's been instructed to put it in this JSON title field. And then for the final slide, there we go. Little robot did his job. And so currently we're sharing about 240,000 records to DPLA. So these little robots, they're pretty busy, but I think they have pretty high job satisfaction. The final step of this harvest process, once all the robots do their thing and build their JSON documents, all of this metadata gets packaged up and sent along to DPLA, and then they take that information, they unpack it and index it into their systems, which makes it searchable and discoverable. And that's how a harvest is run.
Okay, so hopefully you all understand this process a little bit better now. We do have some links here on the last slide with links to our website, links to our search portal so you can explore some of the content that we've shared to DPLA, a link to our metadata guidelines so that you can explore some of the recommendations we make for shareable metadata, see some of the recommended fields in addition to the required fields, and some of the best practices associated with those fields, as well as appendices that have links to controlled vocabularies and standards, in addition to what's outlined in the guidelines document. And we also have a link to our Getting Started guide so that you can read a little bit more detail about this process and see if you're comfortable applying to be an SSDN content contributor. So now we're happy to take any questions that you may have, either from the topics that we've just discussed, or if you have any additional questions that you've been dying to ask us. So feel free to use the chat box, or I'm going to have it so that you can also unmute yourself if you would prefer to ask your question out loud.
And we're also very eager to get your feedback about this presentation, and if there are other areas that you would have liked us to cover, because we are continuing to build our training and what we're offering to the entire state, the Sunshine State Digital Network, for your ability to participate. So we want as much participation as possible, and we're happy to provide whatever your needs are. We're happy to try to meet those. So let us know if you have any feedback about the presentation as a whole.
And there are no stupid questions. We understand this topic can be daunting for some people. So if you have a question, please don't be afraid to ask it. We're not judging anyone here. It's a judgment-free zone. It seems like we did a flawless job of explaining ourselves, guys.
Well, I also want to say that if you think of any questions after the presentation, we are happy to answer those. You can reach out to us individually. Also, I wanted to say that we are going to begin offering expert office hours in the coming months. So we have individuals who are volunteering to serve as our digital initiative experts and spend about an hour of time to provide, you know, to provide online office hours where you can come and ask any questions you have. It'll be a different format, less presentation, or no presentation, really just specifically there to answer any questions you might have. And yes, there will be a recording of this presentation. So if you missed any part of this presentation, we'll have this available on the Sunshine State Digital Network website, and we can also send the recording, maybe not the recording, we can send a link to the recording and the slides to everyone that has registered. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. And as I said, we are here to help, so please feel free to contact us. Have a great rest of your day.